Okay, the next big topic is called population viability analysis, and I don't expect you to know how to do one of these or any of the details, but I expect you to know what this does and why it's important, and there'll be a couple other terms that you'll need to know that'll be on your term list that are related to population viability analysis. The basic idea is that we want to know if a population will survive over a certain amount of time and be able to avoid extinction. Population viability analysis is one way to make an estimate of an answer for this question. So it's basically a mathematical model of population size, and you can use different scenarios to predict the probability of extinction over a specified time period. Population viability analysis uses natural history, ecological, and demographic data. So all that field work, all that stuff we just talked about applied population biology and censuses and surveys and demographic studies, we need most of that information to put into a PVA, or a population viability analysis. And it's a good model for evaluating extinction risk because you can look at multiple different factors and better understand how different parts of the life cycle influence the probability of extinction of a population. And with this, we can also evaluate if something is important. Do we need more data to make sure we've estimated it correctly? If it's a parameter that maybe we've guessed at, maybe we need to go back and do some more research to be more sure. So it evaluates how population size is affected by multiple independent variables. It includes genetic variation, so we can look at the amount of genetic drift and inbreeding, if you'll remember what those are. It looks at demographic variation, so variability in sex ratio, age of first and last reproduction, age and sex-specific birth and death rates, immigration and emigration. And you can also incorporate environmental variation. So you can put in different frequencies of catastrophes, you can add in carrying capacities, all these sorts of things, so we can help understand what is driving population sizes. So you start by building a model of population size based on mortality rate. So what's the probability that an individual is going to die in a given year? And you might look at the probability that an individual is going to die at different life stages. So if it's a juvenile or an adult or a larvae or something like that. You're going to look at recruitment rate. You're going to need that estimate. And if you remember, that's the rate at which individuals are moving up to be in the reproductive age group. Age distribution, so how many individuals are there at different ages, or the ratio of those different age classes. And then you'll want to know the geographic area that's occupied by this population. Then you add variability into the model. Remember, we talked about stochasticity, both demographic stochasticity and environmental stochasticity. You need that variability in the model so that we can come up with a range of different possibilities. If you have the model predict one population size in, say, 20 years, it's almost certainly going to be wrong. The probability that you get the exact right answer is very low. So what we want to do is add in environmental and demographic variability so we can get a range of answers, so we can think about what the likely possibility is that it will go extinct. And then you run many iterations of the model to get an idea of the variability in potential futures. So it's very hard to know for sure what the exact answer is, but with good information you can make an estimate. Like the model predicts that there is a 50% probability that population will go extinct in 20 years. Or we're predicting that the population will be between 100 and 150 individuals in 50 years. Things like that. You want a range of possibilities. So this is an example of some output. Now, this model, this example, looked at 4 different runs of the model. Now, you wouldn't want to run it 4 times. You would want to run it hundreds or thousands of times so you can figure out better what the different possibilities are. But you can see there's variability. They started all of these models at the same place, and they ran them through time, and they put in different variability. If there was no variability, the lines would be exactly the same. But you can see that most of the populations had a crash in them, but some of them recovered. One of them went extinct very early on, and so you can see there's a range of possibilities. The population could be a lot larger than where it started. It could be a little larger than where it started. It could be about the same, or they could be extinct. So this shows the variability that you can get. One really useful extension of the population variability analysis is a sensitivity analysis. And I do some population modeling for amphibians, and I regularly do these sensitivity analyses, and they're really, really important and very, very useful. What it does is identify how sensitive the model is to variation in different parameters. And parameters are those things we put into the model. So the survival rate, the reproduction rate, the probability of a catastrophe. These different kinds of parameters go in there, and we want to know if one of those changes, which one would alter the model output the most. And so which variables are most important in determining extinction risk? And those are the ones we want to focus our conservation efforts on. Also, if we feel like we don't have good data to estimate that particular parameter, that may indicate that we want to go out and collect more data so we can be sure that that's the right parameter estimate. So example is here, if adult mortality is the most important, then actions that decrease adult mortality will benefit the population the most. If recruitment is the most important, then actions that increase juvenile survival will benefit the population the most. So we think about which life stage is affecting extinction risk the most, and then we can target our management efforts at that life stage. And there are some things you would do to help adults live longer, and there are different things you might do to help juveniles live longer. And it depends greatly on what species we're talking about. So this shows an example. So this is a population viability analysis for reindeer. And we see that they started the population here, and then they ran it under 3 different conditions. So they had current conditions continue, which is the blue line. They eliminated the harvest, which you can see, modest increase, small increase in the population size, the number of caribou. And then they improved calf survival here on the green line. And you can see that that had a much, much larger influence on population size than eliminating the harvest. So this would tell, assuming that you have funds to do both, that it would be better to improve calf survival than to get rid of the harvest if you're trying to increase the number of caribou. And so this is something that the population viability analysis would tell you. So there's lots of questions that can be answered by a population viability analysis. Can a species persist in an area? what is the probability of persistence over some time period? What changes can help keep the population viable? So here's some more specific types of questions. So how would different forest management strategies affect the dwarf trout lily? Is it better to reintroduce one large population or two small populations of whooping cranes? How many walleye, which is a type of fish, can be sustainably harvested from a certain lake? And so with these models, you can put this in and come up with estimates for these different questions. Another common question people have is, what is the smallest population size that doesn't result in extinction in the foreseeable future? And so we're asking, what is the minimum viable population size, which is what I just said. Minimum viable population size is the smallest population size that doesn't result in extinction in the near future. And anytime you're talking about this, you need to specify the extinction probability you're willing to accept and the time period. So you can't just say the minimum viable population size is 50. Well, what extinction probability does that give us? Over how long? It could be that the probability of going extinct in the next 5 years is virtually 0. But in the next 50 years, it could be very high. So you really have to define those two things to say so. Now, this graph is one I want to talk about a bit. And so we have the percentage of populations persisting. So that's essentially the probability of persisting. And so we get the time period here. So if we want to know the minimum viable population, we want to say, okay, well, we want to make sure the population has an 80% probability of persisting for 30 years. So the smallest population size that we could get that would do that would be this blue line. So we're at 30 years, so we wanted to have an 80% probability of persisting. So we get this blue line. It's got to be a population of 51 to 100 individuals. If we were willing to accept a lower probability, like let's say a 20% probability of persisting for 40 years, you could say that it's around 15, or you could even go up to here and say about 31 to 50 individuals. If we look at 50 years and we want there to be a 50% probability, the minimum viable population, again, the smallest population, so this one has about 50% probability of persisting for 50 years, need to be at least 51 individuals. So that would be the minimum viable population size. You see it says 51 to 100, but we want the smallest population size that meets those criteria. And so in this case, we would say 51. And this is a hard concept, so if you're having trouble understanding this, I suggest you read this section in the textbook, or watch this again, or come ask me about it at the review session. So as I said, often stated in terms of years and probability, and the minimum viable population size varies depending on time scale and survival probability goals. Excuse me, for some reason that's hard to say. And so here they've got different lines. Black is for greater than 90% survival. And you can see if you want to persist for only 10 years, you need less than 1,000 individuals. But if you want to survive for 100 years, you need at least 3,000 individuals. If you want the population to survive with a 90% chance for 1,000 years, you're going to need over 100,000 individuals. If your goal is only a 50% chance of surviving, for 10 years, you only need about 100 individuals. And so you can see that this changes depending on what you're looking for. And if you're interpreting these, you need to make sure you look at the axes on these graphs very closely. So a lot of times there's time on the x-axis, but the y-axis might be either the probability of survival or the minimum viable population size. So those are important things to look for when you're interpreting these graphs. So the next thing you can also look at is what is the minimum amount of habitat needed to support the minimum viable population size. That might sound confusing, but basically you want to know how big of an area you need to preserve to make sure you have a population that's going to persist for a long time. So you want your habitat that you're preserving to at least support the minimum viable population size. So this minimum amount of habitat is called the minimum dynamic area. It's the minimum amount you need to have a population that will exist for a longer period of time. But to do this, you need to know something about space use, which might mean something like a home range size, so the average daily amount of area used by an individual, and the overlap in those. And so this graph shows the probability that a population will persist here and how big the population is. And then they color-coded them whether they went extinct or did not extant. Remember, they're still alive. And this is the algorithm from the population viability analysis. And so here they see that the smaller amounts of habitat down here, like less than 25 hectares, most of those populations went extinct. But when you got over 25, you started having them be more likely to make it. And so we see this curve, and if we want like a 90 or 95% probability, we need at least 100 hectares to have a minimum viable population size. And so that would be the minimum dynamic area. In this case is 100 hectares. So how does this inform conservation? Well, usually it depends on what type of species, how big of a population they need. So some species have more individuals anyway, so you can imagine if you went out and surveyed, there's going to be a lot more blades of grass than there are going to be wolves, right? And so we see small herbivores can live in parks that are smallish, and you can see the numbers of individuals in the population increase with the size of the park. But you need a bigger park area to have a population of large herbivores, like here's a picture of a wildebeest. And so we see that as the park area increases, we get larger populations. But again, we don't start getting large herbivores until we have a certain size population. We don't get large carnivores until we have even larger parks. But again, they still scale with population size, where we get larger populations with larger parks. And so this can inform what we need to do when we're planning wildlife preserves. So this is similar, but it actually looks at particular parks. You can see these are national parks in the United States, and this shows how big they are on the x-axis, and it's on a log scale, which means it goes up by an order of magnitude. And then we have the mammal extinction rate. So somebody went out and collected old species lists for all these different national parks, and then looked at which of the species were still there. And they correlated that with the size of the national park. And so we can see the extinction rate was highest in the smallest parks, like Bryce Canyons. But the extinction rate was the lowest at the largest parks, places like Grand Teton and Olympic National Park, And you can see that the other ones fall along this line pretty well. There's some variability, but you can see Zion is a medium-sized park, has a medium extinction rate. And so this works pretty well for understanding what we should do for conservation. If we want lower extinction rates, we're going to need larger parks. All right, so problems with population viability analysis. Generally, you need a lot of data. You need at least 10 years of data to build a good population viability analysis. It requires accurate ecological data for the species. And I mentioned before that there is not a lot of good funding for natural history information. This is the kind of thing you really, really need, or is very helpful when you're trying to list a species as endangered. But a lot of times they don't provide funding for these types of studies until the species is already endangered or very close to being endangered, which means that it's hard to list them if you don't have this data, but there's not money for the data. So that creates a major problem. PVAs can be very sensitive to variation in certain parameters, and we don't always know which ones those are until we have a lot of extra data. It's also not sophisticated enough to count for all relevant parameters. It's very difficult to put in all the different possible weather parameters, disease, predators, prey. Like, you start to get really complicated, and these models really aren't able to deal with that many things. Also, if we don't have data on something that's unanticipated, like we don't know what happens if a hurricane hits this area, and then a hurricane does hit that area, but that's not a normal thing, then we're not going to be able to predict that. So it's not going to give you accurate output if you don't have all the important things inside the population viability analysis model.